Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to this very important meeting. I would like to say at the very outset that the conflict between Palestine and Israel has to be seen in a historical perspective and also in the light of the human declaration of the human rights. These problems are inherited from the colonial rulers. The Britishers and the other colonial rulers, they have created a large number of conflicts among the third world countries. And most of these conflicts are continuing even to this day. And they are trying to use these conflicts to their advantage so that their hegemony over the world can be established without any break, without any resistance. So that is the aim. And this conflict in Palestine is also an outcome of that colonial policy. They wanted, obviously, Palestinians were residing there. It was occupied by the Ottomans. And from Ottoman Empire, when the Britishers have acquired it, instead of leaving them to the local Palestinians, they have decided to divide it and give a territory to the Jewish people for their settlement. Now, a small patch, if they had given to the Jewish people for their settlement, it perhaps would not have created any problem. But having come to that area, they started expanding themselves. And from Golan Heights to the Gaza Strip to the Western Bank, now they want to control the entire Sinai Peninsula so that and want to push out the Palestinians from these regions. They not only occupied these areas, but slowly started settling their own people in these areas. It is the government reports, according to Israel government reports, nearly 4 lakh people have settled in the Gaza area, in the Western Bank itself. Now, this is the major problem. Now, Palestinians are, over a period of time, have been demanding their rightful claim for a statehood. It is the only country in the world, perhaps, without a territory of its own. And we always tell the students in political science classes that Palestine is one example of a state without a territory. Normally, every state has a territory, but this is one state which doesn't have a territory with well-defined boundaries. From time to time, they've been pleading for a territory where they can live peacefully and where they can establish and their own government and continue to live peacefully without any attack, any domination from the other communities. Now, this, in fact, has been the demand of the Palestinians. Almost for over 70 years, they've been fighting for this right. Earlier, under the leadership of Arafat, and subsequently Hamas has emerged as the important representative of the Palestinian people. Now, what are they asking? They're simply asking for a country of their own, and in which there will not be any interference by any other country in the world. And it is naturally a justified demand, and international law clearly says that every country and every nation has a right to self-determination. They have a right to decide their future without any interference by the other countries. This is what India has demanded. And we have fought against the British colonial rulers demanding the right to self-determination. Palestinians also have been asking for a right to self-determination. And unfortunately, the Israelis have been interfering into this right. Now, they have been restricted to the small Gaza Strip, I think about 140 or so square kilometers, and where they are forced to live. And in that 140 square kilometer territory, they're expected to live. But that is not sufficient. There are neither resources to provide them the employment. There are neither, the necessary livelihood opportunities. So Palestinians are compelled to migrate. they're compelled to migrate to the Western Bank, to the other Israeli territories. And that perhaps is the major source of conflict. From time to time, Israel wants to control this. Israel wants to usurp these economic rights of the Palestinian people. And there is a conflict over water. So it is, they're trying to, in a way, usurp the resources, control everything for themselves, and have a total claim over the Western Bank. That is the source of conflict between the two countries. As our friends have mentioned rightfully earlier, that it is not merely a conflict between two religious communities. It is not merely a conflict between, two communities, so to say, but it is a conflict between Palestinians who have been claiming for a rightful a right to self-determination, and the Israeli state, which has been trying to deny this right to self-determination to Palestinians. That is the source of conflict. And that source of conflict, where do we stand? Over the years, India has supported Palestinians because, we also fought for right to self-determination. We could sympathize with the Palestinians. We understood the demand of the Palestinians and supported them. Yasser Arafat was seen as a great friend of India, and India always stood by Yasser Arafat in all the international forums and demanded that a state is the Palestinian state has to be created at the earliest. And Yasser Arafat was also awarded a doctorate degree by Usmania University. That clearly shows, the concern India had for Palestinian cause in those days. But over a period of time, we have been thinking more in terms of our own security, ignoring the basic values which guided the international policy in the earlier period during the Nehru's regime and subsequently during Indira Gandhi's period. They were guided by the principles of non-alignment. They were guided by the principles of non-interference. So those were the principles which guided non-interference, mutual respect, the peaceful settlement of all disputes. These were the principles based on which we have built our foreign policy. And within that framework, we had sympathy for Israel. We supported Israel. But today, these are no longer the central concerns of India. We want to expand our business. We want to expand our trade. We want to expand our hegemony over the international, in the international politics. And therefore, we have given up some of these fundamental principles. Today's regime basically thinks that a friendship with Israel will be more useful. It helps us in creating these strong security forces that enable us to negotiate with the terrorists. Earlier thinking was not like that. They always thought in terms of a political resolution of these disputes within the democratic framework, within the constitutional framework. Today, we have given up those values. That value framework has been completely surrendered in the interest of, expanding our own, for realizing our own interest, economic interest at the international level. We are not against, any attempt to expand in India's interest in the international economic realm. But you can't, completely disregard the constitutional framework. The Constitution has clearly laid out that the responsibility, it is the responsibility of the government of India to promote peace in the international sphere. So we should work for peace even in Palestine. So that should be our responsibility. Today we have given up those responsibilities. We must remind the government that its own constitutional obligation is to promote peace in West Asia, and more so in Palestine. What Palestine is demanding is a separate country for them. And that demand is a justifiable demand and it has to be fulfilled. And, the conflict has intensified ever since Hamas has emerged as the representative. Who becomes the representative of Palestinian people is a right of the Palestinian, is something that the Palestinian people alone can decide. It is not for Israel to impose some representatives on Palestinian community. That goes against the tenets of right to self-determination. Israel is violating the right to self-determination. Hamas has emerged and Hamas has been trying to create a country where people can live peacefully, and they wanted to have a peaceful settlement of all the disputes. They have been negotiating since 2007, and every time Israel makes a promise and an assurance that a territory will be granted without any interference to Palestine, but subsequently they completely go back on their own promises, and that's the reason why there is violence. One last word I want to say. Now, this violence is so inhuman that they are bombarding civilian areas. Small children are killed in this conflict. Civilians, innocent civilians are killed in this conflict, and that is inhuman. We all have to stand up and condemn this violence, condemn this carpet bombing on Palestinian areas, and condemn this killing of innocent people, more so the children in Palestinian areas. This is inhuman. We all must condemn it. The question of the religious or the cultural identity of Palestine is, in my opinion, is unimportant. What is very important is that it is in a very inhuman manner, completely disregarding the international covenants, agreements, international declarations, that Israel is indulging in violence against Palestinian community. And that is against the principles of the India's freedom struggle. One reason why we should condemn this violence and support Palestine to have and help Palestine to get its own separate state and realize its own right to self-determination. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.